Much for the kind introduction, and thank you to all the attendees who are joining us today. It's really a great privilege and honor to be presenting our research in front of you. So let me just share my screen. Are you all able to see I think it should start now. Okay, I think
Yes,
it's working.
indeed. Yes, indeed. It is
Okay,
working.
great. Perfect. So we'll be presenting our research on the political resource curse, more specifically on one project which already yielded a publication, which was focused on the case of Timor-Leste, and on some, to a lesser extent, on some work in progress, which is focused on Guyana. So um, the sort of like the point of departure, the empirical puzzle in the literature is this correlation. We see that as oil rents, or like as percentage of GDP increase, Freedom House scores, Polity 5, VDEM, sort of like various measures, commonly used indices of democracy in the political science literature, tend to sort of like go lower. And so we have this negative relationship between oil rents, or sort of like oil wealth, oil dependence, and levels of democracy. Now, the idea that sort of like mineral wealth as a sort of like development strategy could be something that has negative consequences is quite an old idea. It goes back at least to sort of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. We have here sort of like some writing from Ricardo that says this increase of the quantity of those metals has not, it seems, increased that annual produce, and has neither improved the manufactures and agriculture of the country nor mended the circumstance of its inhabitants. Spain and Portugal, the countries which possess the mines, are, after Poland, perhaps the two most beggarly countries in Europe. So this is kind of like the idea that there might be a resource curse, a natural resource curse, quite an old idea, but the term itself then was coined in the early 90s, and then throughout the 90s and in the early 21st century, there's a really huge literature that developed, and we can broadly sort of distinguish two branches of that literature. The first on the economic resource curse, so that attributes sort of like weaker growth, or the Dutch disease, to natural resource wealth, and the political resource curse, which links natural resource wealth or dependence with things like authoritarianism, conflict, poor governance, such as, for example, increases in corruption, etc. So the question now is, we're focusing on the political resource curse in our research. The question is, does this political resource curse really exist? Now, there's probably a majority of publications in favor of the existence of the curse, but there's still quite strong disagreement. And so some, scholars in the literature believe that there's either no effect at all, or that oil might even be a blessing, so might actually have positive effects on things like democracy and other political phenomena. Now, we believe that because of the sort of causal heterogeneity in this relationship, there's probably not going to be sort of like at any point in time, a fully settled debate, sort of that we can say, okay, this is definitely sort of like a curse, or this is definitely a blessing. So what we've seen in recent years emerge as a kind of sort of tentative scholarly consensus is kind of the idea that, well, the effect of oil is not sort of uniform across time and space, but it's really highly contextual. And what does it depend on? How do countries avoid the resource curse? Well, here the kind of the consensus that emerged is sort of like what we could maybe call sort of like an institutionalist consensus. And so here the idea is that avoiding the resource curse is said to depend on the quality of pre-existing political institutions. So how good institutions were before the discovery of natural resource of the natural resources. And so in the cases where these institutions were weak, the curse is likely. In the cases where the quality of institutions was very high, like the typical example being Norway, for example, there are no negative effects. The second institutionalist argument is that in the present day, sort of like when sort of like natural resource wealth is kind of already sort of being produced or revenue is flowing, what really matters or what really helps to avoid the curse are good resource governance institutions. And so here there's a number of those that have been put forward in the literature, such as, for example, a technocratic natural resource fund that is insulated from partisan politics, private ownership instead of state ownership of natural resources has also been argued as sort of like a way to avoid the resource curse and kind of prevent governance basically from accessing and distributing those rents. Now, what we sort of like the issue that we have with some of these institutionalist explanations is that we thought that they were overly structuralist and they didn't always give a good explanation of why politicians would actually kind of choose to set up these institutions in the first place. Another issue I think that also sort of like that we tried to highlight was that the definitions also of what actually constitutes good or strong institutions can sometimes be quite vague, or if it's not vague, then there's just sort of like a very long list of potential factors, which doesn't necessarily always give people, readers, the sort of like the wider public clear indication of which institutions really matter. And the last sort of issue that we found was problematic, especially then with regards to the case we were then going to study, was what if there were no real pre-existing institutions in the first place? What if there was no state to begin with? So how do we explain outcomes when the state or the sort of like the foundation of the state is actually posterior to the discovery of oil? And so the question that we kind of tried to ask within our first project that then focused on Timor-Leste is, well, if these institutionalist explanations are insufficient, what other factors could perhaps be important for escaping negative effects of oil, and to the extent that they do matter, how does oil affect them? And so we wanted to answer these questions by studying first, as I mentioned, the case that we published a paper on, which was published in Studies in Comparative International Development, I think a year or two ago now. And there we have a situation where an independent state was, as I said, built after oil discovery. And I think the Guyanese case, one of the reasons why we're so interested in looking at that more closely was that this is very much an ongoing process, and it therefore allows us also to study political dynamics in a way that is not necessarily that easy to do with sort of things that are already sort of like in a more distant past. So yeah, I'm handing it over to my colleague Jeff now, who's going to talk a little bit about the Timor case.
Thanks, Moritz. And also, I'd like to say thanks to everybody for attending. So even if you haven't ever thought about Timor-Leste before, I assure you it actually is a pretty fascinating case. And in many ways, maybe we'll have some, if not lessons, at least maybe some insights or some things to think about for a case like Guyana. So Timor-Leste is exactly the sort of place where one would expect the political resource curse to occur if it does in fact exist. It had a history of colonialism, it didn't have very good institutions, and it had previous experience with authoritarian governance, as well as a history of conflict. On top of that, it also has a sort of lots of demographic factors that one would associate with a real risk of the political resource curse. For example, poverty and low levels of literacy, and also lots of opportunity. There weren't strong institutional structures, so state officials and others, if they wanted to simply loot the resources, that was certainly something that was possible. When we think about this, then we are sort of struck with a fundamental question, which is Timor-Leste, by all of the sort of existing indicators, should be a case where the political resource curse actually exists, but it doesn't. And in fact, it's now not only a consolidated democracy, it's now the most democratic country in Southeast Asia. And if you look on your right, you can sort of see these quite sort of impressive and sort of steadily upward trajectories of what is the level of democracy in Timor-Leste. And if you extended these out further, I would think you see even more positive trends because there actually also been presidential and parliamentary elections since then, which have also involved yet another change in government. Next slide, please, Moritz. In case you're wondering, this is where Timor-Leste is. It's in Southeast Asia. It's about the size of Connecticut, if you know your United States geography, and it's also a relatively small country population-wise. It has about 1 million people. Next slide, please. And in case you really, really want to know about the logistics of oil in Timor-Leste, this is where the vast majority of the reserves are. Next slide. So I want to sort of go through a little bit of the sort of rationales about why, the current explanations of why Timor-Leste doesn't have the resource curse, what sort of explains them. So first of all, we can see that there weren't particularly good pre-existing institutions. So there's no, they didn't have any strong institutions, and indeed there were so much conflict after the departure of Indonesian occupiers that actually most of the infrastructure was destroyed. And as a matter of policy, Indonesia didn't even allow a sort of professional class to develop. So you definitely don't have good pre-existing institutions. There wasn't particularly great research governance. Yes, it was private foreign company managed, which the literature says tends to prevent the resource curse, but also does tend to have other types of negative externalities, perhaps. And also it didn't have a resource fund that really controlled spending. So one of the things that Moritz already highlighted is the sort of notion that by putting strict controls on how officials spend money, this sort of will stop the resource curse. Well, Timor-Leste didn't do that. They're sort of spending. They're doing exactly the opposite of what the literature says you're supposed to do. And there doesn't seem to be particularly good structural conditions for democracy. I've already talked about that, so I won't belabor it. Next slide, please, Moritz. So what exactly is then our argument? So what we sort of argue is that Timor-Leste and the focus on pre-existing institutions may in fact be overstated. And then in fact, Timor-Leste did not avoid the resource curse by having good policy institutions or exceptional institutions of resource management or strong favorable conditions. So basically everything that you would think would be the reasons why Timor-Leste is democratic under existing literature doesn't seem to really explain what's going on there. So we argue that something else is going on. And we highlighted a number of sort of key factors which we think are really important, and many of them we do think will also be relevant for situations outside of Timor-Leste. So first, there were high levels of legitimacy among the major parties derived from the independence struggle. So unlike some places where you would have, in South Africa famously, for example, where you have the ANC, right? You have one hegemonic political party that's sort of fully associated with the independence movement and a successful independence struggle. You actually have multiple parties, the CRNT and the Fretland, which are both considered legitimate. So you can have real electoral competition without being seen as sort of anti-independence or not recognizing the contributions of the independence struggle. Next slide, please, Moritz. The second thing, and this is just as important, is that the political parties were actually committed to democracy. And maybe this just seems intuitive, but maybe it doesn't. And this is sort of this idea that in order for democracy to survive, one of the key things is that the parties themselves have to be committed to democracy. And we can sort of see how this sort of works in a more technical sense. If you look on the slide, you can see the CRNT and Fretland are in red. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive, but basically the lower your score, the more committed to democracy you are. So you can see these are committed to democracy parties that are about on par with, for example, or better than the Labour Party in New Zealand. And I'll let you draw your own conclusions, but if you look on the far right, there's the Republican Party in the United States. So on the third issue, what we can see is that because no single party was hegemonic and no single party was able to fully dominate, and there was a sort of meaningful necessity for compromise, the institutions that were set up in Timor-Leste themselves were conducive to democratic consolidation. So what does that actually mean? Well, simply, instead of having a sort of winner-take-all presidential system or something like that, you had proportional representation with closed party lists with a pretty reasonable vote threshold of about 4%. So, this is the kind of stuff that political scientists who really care about this say, on the whole, that's a pretty good way of organizing your polity to make it likely that democracy is going to have a pretty good chance. Again, there's no guarantees, but it doesn't incentivize winner-take-all politics. And last but not least, international actors actually played a constructive role in Timor-Leste. Now, this is not to say that everything that the international actors did but was helpful, but they did provide invaluable resources, investment, and technical assistance for a country which had been pretty devastated by conflict and had also sort of suffered from underdeveloped for a long time under Indonesian and Portuguese rule. Next slide, please. So that is the short and sweet of Timor-Leste. I promise to answer any more questions you have, but I know that you're probably going to be most interested in what my colleague Moritz and I have to say about our sort of tentative findings and our early thinking about the actual situation in Guyana. Thank you.
Yeah, so for the study on Guyana, we look at, I think, the political resource curse also a bit more broadly. So we're not looking solely sort of like at the relationship between oil wealth and levels of democracy, but we're kind of like overall trying to understand how likely is it that Guyana would experience some of the negative effects that we see more generally in the broader political resource curse literature. So in terms of authoritarianism, potential for civil conflict, worsening of governance, etc. So I'm not, I obviously don't need to tell you much about sort of like the Guyana case overall in terms of sort of like I guess the history and the sort of like recent history also with the oil discovery. So I'll move on to the next slide here, but you can obviously see that Guyana has seen really sort of incredible growth rates in recent years due to the discovery of oil and sort of like the production of oil. So now to the question that interests us all, how susceptible is Guyana to the political resource curse? And so what we did is we took a look at the literature and tried to understand sort of like based on what we know from the literature in sort of 2024, 2025, what are some of the factors that make it likely or less likely that Guyana will experience the sort of like political resource curse? Now, there's some positive things. Most of all, the things that we mentioned earlier with regards to the literature saying that good pre-existing institutions are positive to avoid the political resource curse. So in that regard, the positive institution or the good institution that is most often cited is simply democracy. So if you were democratic as a country before sort of you sort of like the oil wealth accrued, then you're much less likely to experience to sort of like to descend into authoritarianism. And since Guyana has been democratic since 1992, this is something that sort of like overall bodes well for the country. Now, the second sort of reason why we can be optimistic, at least sort of like according to the literature, is also the nature and structure of the oil industry. So what some studies have found is that when oil is located offshore, or when there's no national oil company, it means that governments have actually a much harder time to access and control oil rents, or sort of like the rents from these oil and gas revenues. And therefore, this then makes it harder for them to sort of like use this money to spend on sort of like expanding the security apparatus, distributing rents to supporters, etc. So this is also something that is generally considered positive for Guyana. in terms of the literature on the political resource curse with a specific focus on, there's also reason to be optimistic. What has been shown is that it's usually more likely that you see things like civil war breaking out when there's an overlap of natural resource wealth with ethnic divisions. Now in Guyana, this is not the case because the oil is located offshore. On top of that, there's also no history of civil war. So this is, I think, also something that that speaks can make us optimistic for the Guyanese case. And then lastly, there's also studies that show that sort of like the international environment, the kind of like how democratic is the quote unquote neighborhood of the country also matters. And here, with perhaps the exception of Venezuela, Guyana is located in overall quite democratic part of the world. Now, there are also some risks that we can identify based on the literature. The first one is the history of contested elections and sort of like challenges to democratic governance since 1992. So we're talking here about sort of like instances of electoral violence, but also the refusal to sort of like accept the results of elections, etc. The second point is that oil could obviously be a tempting target for hostile states. We see that in the international relations literature that sometimes countries might be sort of like having an eye on sort of the natural resource wealth of neighboring countries. Sorry, and here obviously the question is, is there perhaps sort of like a link between Venezuela's claim or sort of like recent more assertive claim on Essequibo and Guyana's newfound oil wealth? Another sort of like point that is potentially sort of like a source of tension in the future is the contract that Guyana signed with Exxon, with the consortium that's led by ExxonMobil. So we have cases like, for example, Bolivia in the mid-2000s, where we have political instability as a result of an unfair natural resource contract signed with a foreign company. And so in the Bolivian case, this led then to sort of like widespread protests, riots, etc., that then kind of paved the way later for the election of Evo Morales, which was for quite some time a successful democratic country and leader in government. But where towards the end we also see sort of like tendencies towards democratic backsliding and sort of like becoming more authoritarian. Now, perhaps some of the most challenging and more problematic aspects are actually related to the country's polarized political system. So, as you know, the Guyanese parliament is technically elected with proportional representation, but due to the sort of simultaneous first past the post presidential election, we actually have winner take all politics, and these dynamics are potentially, as based on sort of like our tentative findings, perhaps the most problematic actually for the prospects of Guyanese democracy in the sort of like medium to long term. Another point is coming back also to what Jeff discussed in the Timorese case is the ideological commitment to democracy. So that's also something where this an issue that potentially comes up is sort of like how committed are the major parties to substantive liberal democracy. And I think this is something that I think probably will also need to be sort of addressed, and where we think that some improvements in this regard would also strengthen the prospects of Guyanese democracy. The last point is one that could probably have been also mentioned in the sort of reasons why we can be more optimistic, but this kind of only depends on sort of like how you actually judge the literature on this point. So parts of the literature emphasize sort of like fiscal prudence and conservative management of natural resource wealth, put this in a natural resource fund so that it can't really be touched and spent. and let's sort of like let's like sort of save it for future generations. But there's also increasing evidence by more recent studies that show that, what some sort of like in a sort of like with a kind of like negative connotation, sort of like called, patronage, that, this is just money going towards sort of, spending to political supporters or to sort of like appease the people, that this is actually quite good and can be potentially stabilizing for democracy. And this is to some extent, I think, also quite intuitive in the sense that, if people don't feel that there's tangible benefits to sort of like the oil wealth, to the natural resource wealth that their country has, it might actually increase dissatisfaction if the current political system is formally democratic. And it might increase then the appeal, if the appeal of authoritarian alternatives, if there are sort of parties or leaders who promise to, spend more of the resources on things that people want, than sort of like the democratic leaders. So the question is, will Guyana, will sort of like the governments and will sort of like the democratic parties in Guyana ensure that people feel the newfound oil wealth? Now, one question that we've been, sort of like grappling with and that we're currently sort of like doing research on is also the extent to which Guyana perhaps has already experienced the political resource to some extent. Now, on the right-hand side, you see sort of like a chart by that's based on data from VDEM, which is sort of like the most widely used democracy index in political science at the moment. And so what we observe here is that we see from the sort of just like the couple of years before 2020, we see evidence of democratic backsliding, and we believe that these scores in the index are attributable to events in Guyana in the sort of like end period of President Granger's term, with the delays in the election after losing the no confidence vote in 2018, and reported attempts to alter results of the 2020 election. Ultimately, democracy prevailed. We have, had peaceful democratic transition of power in 2020 to a new government, but at least sort of like in the scores, this hasn't sort of like had like a great reflection yet. So the question is this sort of like evidence of a pre-source curse, which is sort of like the term that's in the used in the literature for kind of negative effects attributable to oil that happened before the oil revenue is actually even flowing. So in the case of Guyana, I think this only sort of like really starts to happen in, I think, towards the end of 2019. So, do we perhaps see already these kind of like negative political effects occurring before even sort of like the money starts to flow in earnest? But our take so far, our tentative findings, is that most of the problematic kind of like political dynamics with regards to, the prospects for, Guyanese democracy are actually present since before oil discovery. It's possible that oil may, to some extent, have raised the stakes a bit, but fundamentally, sort of the overall dynamics that are, from a political science perspective, potentially problematic for the stability and quality of Guyanese democracy were actually already present before 2015. So the biggest risks then are not really rooted in oil, but rather in this combination of ethnicized politics and a winner-take-all political system. And again, as I said, oil may perhaps raise the stakes somewhat. Now, what can Guyana do to avoid the curse then? Well, one thing that might also be interesting here in the context of the economic of like, many of you are probably in economics or familiar perhaps more also with the literature on the economic resource curse. And one of the things that, we found, and, we both mentioned on the Timorese and on the Guyanese cases, is that spending a lot now may not be, in line with what we know from, the literature on the importance of sort of like fiscal prudence, of, insulating sort of like natural resource funds from politicians, etc. And that this may not be sort of like the best economic policy, but it can be actually quite important to ensure, satisfaction with the democratic system. So here we might actually have sort of like a kind of policy conflict between what might be good politics and what might be good economics. And so we believe that the most important things actually to sort of strengthen democracy in Guyana would be for major parties to, strengthen their ideological commitment to substantive liberal democracy, and B, to embrace institutional reform away from winner-take-all politics towards institutions that foster cooperation, like in the case of Timor-Leste, with a system of like real proportional representation. And we know that there's a constitutional reform committee that's currently working in Guyana, and that has also been tasked with examining the prospects for electoral law reform. But so far, I think most of the people that we've spoken to, at least, seem to be not very optimistic that there would be sort of like fundamental changes in that winner-take-all political system, due to the fact that it largely benefits to the major parties, especially when they're in office. So I'll hand it over to Jeff, who will draw sort of like our final conclusions.
Thanks, Moritz. Well, we always, when we talk about good things or bad things, we always try and end on a high note and on a note of positivity. So for us, the key thing is that, oil is what you make of it, and there's no inherent reason why that it needs to be a curse, and it can definitely be a boon. And it is, it is a sort of, as many people that we've talked to, everyone says it's a transformative resource, and it can do some pretty amazing things. And so the key will be about how, the Guyanese people and the Guyanese political leaders decide to spend it, what they choose to spend it on, and whether or not that sort of, delivers for, the people at large, if that delivers, economic diversification, et cetera. There's nothing inherent in the literature or elsewhere that says, oil has to be bad or that it has to be good. This will ultimately come down to, choices that people and institutions make. And so for us, the sort of the key takeaway points are, we just think that it's really important to sort of keep in mind notions of agency, ideas, and beliefs, and keep in mind that the actual sort of specific choices and decisions you take really matter. It's also really good to have divided political power and not sort of have one overwhelming political party. And so in that sense, that's kind of an optimistic note. And we also note that the international community can be constructive or it can be unconstructive. It will really depend. And ultimately, that the resource curse, while a useful thing to keep in mind, may not always be the most useful frame for sort of understanding the particular dynamics in an oil-rich country. So thanks for listening to us. I know we went over a little bit longer than we promised to, but we're really looking forward to answering your questions and hearing your feedback. So thank you so much.